All right, continuing through Proverbs this evening. I want to do something just slightly different tonight and bring two concepts together. This is something I have been thinking about lately and just decided to make a study out of it. And so I wanted to share that with you this evening. So far, out of the six major themes we've studied, we've looked at family, we've looked at pride and humility, that was recently, and we've looked at the concept of work, and we looked at the concept of speech. And so I wanted to bring two concepts together. I was thinking a few weeks ago about providing a resource on conflict resolution from just the book of Proverbs. And so I put a study together, and I wanted to work through that with you all. And I in an effort to bring together, really it brings together these concepts of speech and of pride and humility. And so I don't have as many verses for you tonight. We have really been just going through a shotgun effect of Proverbs. And so tonight, we're really just looking at one primary concept, and it's the concept of conflict resolution. And some ways that I think Proverbs provides us wisdom pertaining to resolving conflict. And so maybe you can take these principles and you can apply them to your marriage. That's, of course, an appropriate and I believe practical context for this. Maybe you can think of applying this in your work. Should you need that? Hopefully not. Maybe you can think of your relationship with your kids. Maybe your kids are at the age, or they're growing into the age where it's not just stop it, don't do that anymore, but you actually have to appeal to some sense and parent their minds, and so you can apply these principles. And so essentially, I have four admonitions or four approaches to wise conflict resolution from the book of Proverbs. We'll pray and then we'll begin to work through that together. Father, we thank you for this book. We thank you that it provides for us wisdom. Certainly, it is a reminder that when we lack wisdom, all we need to do is ask it, and you'll provide it liberally. You'll provide it generously, and you have certainly provided it generously in this book. And so I pray that now as we come into a very specific study from this book, that you would use this to be an effective time for your people. I ask that you would make us wise according to your word now. In Jesus' name, amen. How many of you have ever been in a discussion with someone? Maybe it's your spouse. Maybe think about your spouse right now. It's probably the easiest frame of reference for this. You have been in a discussion with someone, and you can just feel that discussion beginning to go a direction that it's just becoming unhelpful. Didn't start that way. Maybe it even started completely neutrally or about something completely uncontroversial. There have been multiple times in conflict resolution with my wife where I have looked at her and said, "We agree, don't we?" And we were fighting unnecessarily. Essentially, we were just coming about it completely different ways, and you actually, at the heart of it, agree on what you're talking about, but you're not on board with how she's thinking about it, and she's not on board with how you're thinking about it. But you can just feel in that conversation, it's beginning to go an unhelpful direction. And then before you know it, the floodgates have opened. And you're asking yourself, how did this happen? what led to this? What are we even talking about? Proverbs 17:14, I think, gives a whole progression for conflict and gives us wise instruction on the front side so that we can avoid it. The beginning of strife. So let's stop right there. The beginning of strife. So the early stage of conflict, if you want to put it that way. The beginning of strife, the earliest stage, is like letting out water. The beginning of strife is like the letting out of water. You know, maybe you can think of the tap. And you know, maybe you're trying to fill up something small, or you don't want the sink on full blast, and so you just turn it a little bit and you open the tap a little bit and it just starts to trickle. Well, use that image and think about it within the context of strife. So think about that conflict, and it's in the early stages, and it just slowly starts to trickle. It's going a certain direction. The water has been let out, and it's just a steady stream. But look at the continued cycle and then the application that is given. Quit before the quarrel breaks out. So it's like the dam has burst, and now we're on full-fledged conflict quarreling mode. All of what we're going to talk about this evening in conflict resolution from Proverbs is intended to help us obey that verse. It's intended to help us turn off the tap before the water gets out of control. So Proverbs 17:14, that's the verse to frame all of this. This is not necessarily advice on how it will provide advice, but it's not primarily intended to be advice on how to get out of the conflict. It's intended to help us avoid conflict. Now, certainly I think these principles can help us once we're in it. But those of you know, conflict is a lot harder to get out of once you've started it. So, let's use these 4 principles to quit before the quarrel breaks out. The first thing I'm going to encourage us to do is to be receptive about the issue. Be receptive. All of these are ours. Be receptive. Proverbs 12:15. We read this verse when we talked about humility. The way of the fool is wise in his own eyes, but a wise man listens to advice. Proverbs 16:2, all the ways of a man are pure in his own eyes, but the Lord weighs the spirit. And Proverbs 18:13, if one gives an answer before he hears it, it is folly and shame. So my first admonition to you in wisely resolving conflict is to be receptive, actually have open ears. Have you ever experienced a conflict with somebody, maybe your spouse? Husbands, have you ever started a fight just because you jumped in too early and you didn't even hear the whole matter? You're jumping in with solutions, or you're jumping in with maybe even disagreements, and you haven't even heard the full situation. You know, your spouse starts to get some of it out, or your child. I am so guilty with this with our kids. You know, I really do know our kids pretty well. I do. But I am not omniscient. And so the amount of times I've come in a little bit too hot in a parenting situation just because I didn't actually ask enough questions. and I assumed I knew what happened. Now, 85% of my assumptions with my kids are correct because I really know my kids. But that other 15% could be the difference between a lot of accidental heartache. Just because we come in and we haven't rightly, objectively considered the situation, we haven't asked enough questions. And to him who answers the matter before he hears it, it is folly, it's foolishness. It's not just a matter of, well, I should have waited some time, it'll be fine. This is the attitude of a fool who jumps in before really receiving the concern. I can't remember exactly who it is, but I remember a long time ago, I heard a sermon illustration where the wife of the man who was preaching, and I wish I could remember who it was, but the man who was preaching said that often his wife will come to him and say, "This is not a scary thing. I just want to ask the question, are you in a frame of mind to listen? Are you in a frame of mind to listen?" Now, this was a godly man. I remember that. This is a man who was godly. So she's not just assuming all the time that he's a bad listener. That's just a really good way to go about that. I have something I would like to discuss, and I just want to make sure you're in a frame of mind to hear it. That welcomes the receptivity that is necessary, and it encourages the spouse to listen. We have a phrase that we use in our home. We use it with each other, and we use it with our kids, and it's especially frustrating when we use it with our kids and then, it gets used on us. But anyway, our kids don't use it on us, but are you listening to speak or are you listening to listen? You understand the difference. Listening to speak is I'm hearing what you're saying and I am preparing my response. You can see that in people's eyes, can't you? When you know somebody really well, you can look them in the eye and know they're hearing what you're saying, but their mind is working on a different vein. They're not with you. Be receptive. Don't listen with strings attached. Don't listen with perceptions. Don't listen with ways to make it more comfortable for yourself. Just listen. And my wife isn't even here to hold up the mirror, right? Trust me. The Lord is holding up the mirror. Be receptive. Secondly, so be receptive and be rational. Be rational. I'm going to add a qualification to this rationality in just a moment. But don't speak or don't approach conflict where emotion is driving logic. Proverbs 19:11, good sense makes one slow to anger. It's a really helpful verse. Good sense makes one slow to anger. A situation from your own life, if you're willing to admit it, how many of you have ever gotten really worked up about something? And then someone comes along and they talk to you about it, and you were actually wrong about the thing that you got all worked up about. You had the wrong facts. You had the wrong information. You didn't ask any questions. You didn't do due diligence in doing your research. You just got worked up. Good sense makes one slow to anger. Just using our brains. Just slowing down and saying, I wonder if this is true. And if it's true, let me hear it from multiple perspectives. And once I analyze those perspectives, let me hear it from a biblical perspective and think about it from that perspective. And you apply multiple levels of brain power to this situation rather than just reacting. The second part of that verse, Proverbs 19, verse 11, good sense makes one slow to anger, and it is his glory to overlook an offense. So as we're talking about wisely resolving conflict from Proverbs, one of the questions that should be asked before the water gets let out, one of the ways that we apply basic rationality and good sense is to ask the question, can this be something that's just overlooked? Does it even need to be a thing? Can you just hear it, be receptive, think through it in the moment? Now, and there's different kinds of thinkers, okay? I am an in the moment thinker. I'm thinking in that moment. I'm forming my opinion in that moment. Not everyone is that way. Some people want some time. They hear it and they say, give me a few minutes, and they get out their pad and paper, or they take a day or two or to pray about it and think through it. However you are, learn that about yourself and go back to the person that you need to resolve that conflict with and tell them, give me some time, I want to think through this, I want to pray through it. And even people like me who are in the moment thinkers, you know what we could be helped with? A little more time. Just to apply more good sense. Proverbs 15:18, a hot-tempered man stirs up strife, but he who is slow to anger quiets contention. Give yourself some time. Don't allow the emotion of the conflict to drive the rationale of the conflict. So be rational, be receptive to what you're hearing, and be rational about what you're hearing. Actually apply some brain power to this. Ask yourself questions. Am I thinking about this the right way? Well, I think this about it, but is that a good thing to think about this? That reminds me of this thing that happened, but you know what? I said I forgave that, and so we're not going to go down that road. And now you're thinking yourself back into helpful frames of mind. Be rational. Be receptive. Actually listen. Be rational. Actually think. Don't just react. This third one I think is very important. Be realistic. Be realistic. That is to rightly evaluate and rightly consider the conversation, the conflict. Have a right evaluation of it. Think about it the right way. Proverbs 26, verse 19 is a very interesting verse. And it's a verse we haven't dealt with because, well, I wanted to make sure we had the right opportunity to see it in its use, okay? But Proverbs 26, verses 18 and 19 give us the example of one who doesn't rightly estimate the significance of their words. It's someone who is not rightly evaluating and applying the proper weight of what they say. You know when children are young and they just say crazy things. I mean, they just say crazy things. And you just dismiss it as children being children, you know? They just say crazy things. And some of that is because they think crazy things, right? And some of that is because they've not yet rightly understood the value and impact of words. And when I say value, I mean that the right way. Our words carry value. And they carry weight, and they carry impact. Well, Proverbs 26, 18, and 19 is an illustration of one who uses words carelessly. They don't understand the reality of the value and weight of their words. Like a madman, this is verse 18, like a madman who throws firebrands, arrows, and death is the man who deceives his neighbor and says, I am only joking. That's a weird verse. It is, but it's a helpful verse. So you get the point. There's a fool who is acting foolishly and saying and doing foolish things and then treating it like it's not a big deal. Like a madman who throws firebrands, arrows, and death is the man who deceives his neighbor, big deal, and says, I was just joking. I'm just messing around. Oh, I wasn't serious. Oh, you took me seriously? Which is a cheap way to approach a very serious thing. Okay, so in wisely resolving conflict, we need to make sure we are realistic about what we are dealing with, and we are not approaching weighty matters in cheap ways. And one of the ways that we approach weighty matters in a cheap way, there's two ways: to overstate it and to understate it. To overstate it and to understate it. Overstating is taking something that probably doesn't need to be a big deal and making it a big deal. Not being realistic about the nature of the situation because you haven't thought and because you haven't listened. So that something small becomes something big. We make the mountain out of the molehill. That's not being realistic about the issue. Maybe reality goes, this is just something that we're going to commit to not making it a conflict, to not making it an argument. We together, not just you. Realistically speaking, this does not need to be a problem. Not everything in our relationships and lives are like that. Some things become really big deals and you have to work through them. But I wonder how many times we've spent poorly resolving conflict. And we've made things that have actually become big things because of our reactions to them and how poorly we handled that conflict that never needed to get there to begin with. Just because we weren't realistic about the problem. We weren't realistic with ourselves. And let me caution two personality types here: the fighter and the feigner. Fighters need to fight about everything. Just always have something they need to conquer, always have something they need to, address. They always have something they need to be fighting. And I understand that. I have to watch that tendency in myself. I have a child that he thinks the world is his to conquer. And I love that. Really, I do. I understand that personality type. It is not always helpful in relationships. You do not need to fight about everything. You do not need to verbally joust about everything. Just say, oh, that's interesting. Why do you think that? And then let your spouse talk about it. So I've never thought about that way before. That's really interesting. And value what they say. And then you can just keep going. You say, but I disagree. So? So? Now, if they wake up saying the sky is red, maybe you should have a conversation. Make sure they're okay. But you get my point. How often do we just engage in things that it just doesn't need to be a thing because we haven't been realistic about the problem? It's just not that big a deal. And then the feigners who never involve themselves in conversations because they don't ever care about anything. Just feign interest. Okay, that's great. It's good. But they're not actually involved. Let me caution you against that as well. Because you do need to be involved. You need to have interest. You need to involve yourself in that conversation. You need to be active in that conversation. You're not going to aid conflict resolution by pretending the other person's the one with the problem and that you're just good. They need you to engage a little more than you are. And if you're just always feigning like everything is okay, one of these days it might not be. Be realistic. Rightly evaluate the concern and conversation. Don't overstate it and do not understate it. Fighters tend to overstate, feigners tend to understate. Rightly consider the reality of the situation. Be receptive, be rational, be realistic, and be responsive. Be responsive. Proverbs 15:31, the ear that listens to life-giving reproof will dwell among the wise. Verse 32, whoever ignores instruction thinks little of himself, but he who listens to reproof gains intelligence. The ear that listens will dwell among the wise. But whoever ignores that instruction, so in that conflict, when someone comes to you and maybe they're addressing something that you genuinely need to know about, that you genuinely need to have a humility of heart and you need to live differently. They have counsel for you that you genuinely need to listen. The ear that listens will dwell among the wise. Proverbs 29, verse 1, he who is often reproved yet stiffens his neck will suddenly be broken beyond healing. Now that's a very interesting verse, I think, because I think there's multiple levels to it. You can really discourage somebody by often reproving them. Okay? You probably aren't truly helping your spouse as much as you think you are if you correct everything about them. Okay? So he that is often reproved yet stiffens his neck. Now this is where it gets interesting. Okay? So on the one hand, it may be easy to discourage someone who is often reproved. But why are they often reproved? Because they keep stiffening their neck. This is not a helpful cycle. Because of one who continues to stiffen his neck, they need reproof. So don't, by pride and stubbornness, constantly place someone in the discouraging and difficult situation where you have to often reprove them. Or you have to often be reproved by them. Just be humble and responsive. This is probably a decent verse to be shared with teenagers. Not because I don't love teenagers. I do love teenagers. But I do very much. But those of you that are teen parents, have you ever thought all I do is fight with my kids? It's one after another. Maybe you need to ask yourself the question, are you overcorrecting? You're just on them all the time. Often reproving. And maybe you need to pray that they don't often stiffen their neck. Because there's a huge difference in ministering grace that you desire to restore and heal and provoking to anger. Provoking to anger is born out of the desire to correct. It is. It's trying to correct. It's trying to do something. It's just not doing it the right way. And so maybe our teens need to know this verse. Look, I don't want to be on you all the time. I don't want you to stiffen your neck. And I certainly don't want you to be broken beyond healing. So how do you do that? You humble yourself now. You listen now. And the more you listen, the the less you will know the pain of reproof. Proverbs 13, verse 10. It's a very important verse when we think about conflict resolution from Proverbs. By insolence comes nothing but strife. That word is stubbornness, it's resistance. By insolence comes nothing but strife. But with those who take advice is wisdom. So, loved ones, tonight, is your life characterized by strife? Are your relationships characterized by strife? How much of it is self-perpetuated stubbornness and lack of humility? So next time, the beginning of strife, the tap is turned on and it slowly begins to leak. How can you equip yourself to quit before the water breaks out of the dam? Be receptive. Listen. Hear the whole thing out. Not self-justifying, not forming your defense, not forming your expose, not forming your thesis on why you are always right and the other person does not understand you. Be receptive. Let the Lord weigh your spirit and weigh your own before Him, recognizing that you want to have the spirit of one who's wise and gives answer after he hears, not one who is foolish and gives one before. Be rational, applying good sense so that you are slow to anger and you are contributing good sense to that conflict. Be realistic, rightly evaluate the weight of the conversation and how you are addressing it. Don't overstate, don't understate. And be responsive. Listen to the solution. Listen to the need. Ask. You want to know one way that you can confirm that you are right there is to genuinely and sincerely ask, how do you need me to improve going forward? How do I accidentally give this impression? How am I accidentally being unhelpful in the situation? I want to know what to look for. I want to know what to watch out for. I want to know better words to use. Ask questions communicating that you have heard the situation and you are responding in humility. This is not purely a 4-step admonition to how to have happier relationships in your life. You understand within context, these are things that wise people do. These are practices of people who want to sound like, think like, and respond like Jesus Christ, God's wisdom. It is not just to make your life happier and more peaceful. It is to apply God's wisdom so that we can infuse it into our relationships, even when those relationships, and especially when those relationships get a little bit pressed. Would you pray with me?